Hello, and welcome to this session on ultrasound physics controls and artifacts. I'm Ziad Shaman. I'm an associate professor at Case Western Reserve University Metro Health Medical Center. For disclosures, I have no conflict of interest regarding this talk. I'll start by saying that it's common to have concerns when it comes to technology, such as when will AI take over the world and what will our roles be? But for me, every time I board a plane, I worry about the question, is there a doctor on board? And what am I to do when no hands go up? I imagine walking to the front of the plane where the co-pilot is short of breath, holding her right chest. She says she has a history of spontaneous pneumothorax. I mumble to myself, I wish I had an ultrasound. And that's when a flight attendant hands me a portable machine. I get excited to use my skills to help. I fumble for a few minutes with the machine, turning it upside down and sideways, and then I stare at everyone and ask, where's the on button? That probably won't happen to you on a flight, but might very well happen to you in the ICU, during ACLS, or in front of a set of eager students excited to learn about point-of-care ultrasound. Ultrasound machines are in a lot of places. They are even available on the International Space Station. Here you can see Akihiko Hoshide, an engineer from Japan, examining blood flow in his thigh during a zero-gravity experiment. However, operating an ultrasound machine at the point of care can prove challenging because you become your own tech support person. You are expected to operate a machine and manipulate a transducer that may be new to you, position a patient who most likely cannot cooperate with the exam, obtain technically difficult images, pay attention to patient and operator safety, interpret images in real time, all while holding a sharp instrument close to a vital organ. Therefore, it's important to get the basics down. I have three objectives to cover during this talk: to show how an image can be composed using reflections of sound, to describe how artifacts appear when the assumptions deviate from reality, and to manage machine control so that the image on the screen accurately shows what's under the transducer. As you know, an ultrasound beam is generated by transforming electrical activity to pressure waves. This can be done by using certain crystals with piezoelectric properties or by using micro-machined drums. The opposite is true for these units. Pressure applied to these units generates electrical voltage that can be captured. Once these ultrasound generating elements are subjected to a high voltage alternating current, they vibrate, and the vibration is translated into sound, or ultrasound, through compressions where there's an increase in pressure and rarefactions where there's a decrease in pressure in the surrounding medium. Between activations, the vibrations are suppressed by damping material that is positioned posterior to the vibrating elements. The beam is then focused using an acoustic lens placed anterior to the vibrating elements. Because sound cannot travel through a vacuum, the focused waves pass through an impedance matching material to reach the face of the transducer before being transmitted into the body. The result is a longitudinal mechanical wave that is not too different from the waves you get after dropping a pebble into a pond. As sound travels out, it bounces off objects and is reflected back to the transducer where it can be detected. The transducer calculates the distance to the reflector by measuring the time it took for the sound to return to the transducer. The transducer also determines the intensity of the reflection by measuring the strength of the sound that returns. With distance and intensity information available, an image is ready to be formed. But a single beam will reflect information from a single line or a narrow area. For a two-dimensional image to be formed, multiple beams need to be transmitted to cover a swath of tissue under the transducer. The process is then repeated multiple times so that a two-dimensional image may come to life, showing information in real time. This is called 2D imaging. This is the way we use ultrasound most of the time. M mode, on the other hand, or motion mode, sends only one beam into the tissue, and the returned information about distance and intensity is presented against time. M mode imaging is more sensitive to motion than 2D imaging because a single beam can be sampled more frequently than multiple beams. M mode can be used to detect patterns of movement, such as in this parasternal long axis view of the mitral valve, where you can assess each phase of systole and diastole of the valve leaflets. M mode allows the measurements at different time points, such as of IVC diameter during inhalation and exhalation, or measuring the distance of movement, such as in the assessment of TAPSE in this image. Also, M mode can be used manually to measure the rate of an event, such as fetal heart rate in this example. Now, because the speed of sound equals frequency multiplied by wavelength, and because the speed of sound is assumed to be constant in soft tissue, by manipulating the frequency of crystal vibration, we can generate sound at different wavelengths. The lower the frequency of vibration, the wider the wavelength, and the higher the frequency, the narrower the wavelength of the beam. This is important because frequency affects ultrasound beam degradation in tissue, known as attenuation. Also, frequency determines the details that a beam can provide, known as resolution. These two properties, attenuation and resolution, are like friends who argue all the time because there is constant trade-off between the two. First, we will talk about attenuation and then resolution. In the tissue, ultrasound beams change. This change happens through reflection, refraction, scatter, and absorption. Reflection occurs when the beam is redirected by a surface with a circumference greater than the wavelength of the beam. This is what happens when ultrasound beam interacts with, for example, the diaphragm, a heart valve, or a vessel wall. Reflection is the main way we see tissue boundaries. When the circumference of the reflector is smaller than the wavelength of the beam is scattered in all directions. Scatter occurs, for example, as the beam interacts with gas bubbles in a bowel, small granularities within tissue, or RBCs within the blood. Scatter is what gives granularity to the tissues. When passing through tissue, the ultrasound beam usually goes through several iterations of reflection and scatter before sound energy is eventually converted into heat through absorption. Absorption of ultrasound energy happens continuously, and the beam is generally gradually weakened until it finally dissipates. Of all ultrasound attenuation modes, think of reflection as your friend. Reflection makes ultrasound work. Every medium has a specific sound transmission property called acoustic impedance. Sound will reflect when there is a difference in the acoustic impedances between two media. The bigger the difference, the greater the reflection, and the brighter the boundary will appear on the screen. Looking at the table here, you can see that if lung or bone are present next to another tissue, you can expect the boundary to appear very bright. But not only the boundaries between tissue reflect sound. Since organs are not perfectly homogeneous, tissues appear on ultrasound as different shades of gray. Of note, the non-cirrhotic liver is often used as the standard reference shade of gray to compare other structures in the body, such as the renal parenchyma in this example. Now, of all attenuation modes, think of absorption as your foe. Absorption is the reason ultrasound has limited depth of penetration and the reason water makes a great ultrasound window. When ultrasound is absorbed, it's not absorbed the same way all the time. Different tissues and regions absorb ultrasound differently. Each tissue type has an acoustic absorption coefficient. This coefficient indicates how friendly or unfriendly is the tissue to ultrasound beams. The higher the number, the more unfriendly is the tissue. Water and blood make nice windows because the beam can go through them without losing energy, while air and bone will stop ultrasound in its tracks, therefore making it difficult to see through them. The amount of attenuation of ultrasound depends on tissue type, the distance of travel, and the frequency of the beam. The higher frequency beam, the higher the absorption. And low frequency ultrasound can travel farther before it is absorbed and converted to heat. Loss of energy with depth means deeper structures will return faint signals. The machine deals with the loss of energy by measuring the time it takes the ultrasound pulse to return to the transducer to determine both the location of the reflector and the adjustment needed to compensate for the lost energy. Therefore, by applying an adjustment, the machine can assign uniform brightness at multiple depths for the same tissue type. The adjustment is called time gain compensation, or gain for short. The way an image is gained at each level can be changed by the operator. Even though overgaining will make an image look brighter on the screen, it can result in loss of definition, the same way loud music carries less information than that of a normal conversation. And now a question, because low frequency suffers less absorption, why not use low frequency all the time? And should we declare low frequency a winner? The answer has to do with resolution. Ultrasound has a finite capability to resolve two adjacent objects. Depending on the location of the two objects relative to the direction of the beam, this capability is referred to as axial resolution along the long axis of the beam, lateral resolution across the width of the beam, elevational resolution within the thickness of the beam slice, and temporal resolution, the z-axis, which is important to capture movement in real time. Each of these resolutions depends on different characteristics of the beam and image formation settings. In this table, you can see the different types of resolution types, the factors that influence resolution, and whether an adjustment is possible by the user. For spatial resolutions, which include axial, lateral, and elevational, a high-frequency transducer will result in better resolution. Most transducers allow the operator to choose from different frequency settings. Setting the focal depth and focal point can be adjusted by some machines, which improves lateral resolution. However, elevational focal point is fixed in place and cannot be changed. For temporal resolution, the smaller area scanned, the less time it takes to generate each frame, and the better the frame repetition and the resolution. Therefore, there is an inherent trade-off between resolution and penetration, making it necessary to use different transducers or different settings for different applications. If we use a high-frequency transducer, such as a vascular probe, we expect to have more absorption, therefore less depth. But we also expect to have higher resolution. On the other hand, if we use an abdominal or a cardiac probe, we expect to have better penetration, but the images are not going to be as sharp as they would with a high-frequency vascular probe due to poor resolution in addition to increased scatter. In short, one size will not work for all applications. In general, the goal is to use the highest frequency transducer setting that will reach the desired depth of penetration. Now, for another use of ultrasound, which involves the Doppler effects. When a beam hits a moving reflector, the frequency of the reflected beam changes. The change depends on the direction and the speed of the moving reflector. If the beam hits a moving reflector head-on, it will cause the frequency to increase, which is called a positive shift. If the beam hits a reflector that is moving away, the frequency of the returned beam decreases, which is called a negative shift. The magnitude of the frequency shift can be measured, which allows the machine to estimate the speed of the reflector. But if you happen to be scanning a moving object from the side, say at 90 degrees, there will be no noticeable change in the returned frequency, therefore the speed will be estimated as 0. Actually, the predicted speed of the reflector depends on the cosine of the angle between the beam and the direction of movement of the reflector. That's why the police can only underestimate your speed when using a radar from the side of the road. And if you try to argue your way out of a ticket using physics, please be aware that the police officers are very much familiar with the Doppler equation. I learned that the hard way. There are two ways to use Doppler to detect frequency shifts based on the pulses of ultrasound: in a continuous way or in an intermittent way. Continuous wave Doppler refers to continuous transmission of sound and continuous reception of the reflected beam. In this mode, the transducer uses two crystals, one to send and one to receive. Movement, usually blood flow, along the entire beam is observed. This way, any change in frequency is accurately measured, but the depth at which the echoes are generated cannot be pinpointed. The result is a closed envelope that represents the spectrum of all different speeds along the line of the scan. In pulsed wave mode, a single ultrasound crystal sends and receives sound. Sound signals are sent in short bursts or pulse repetitions, followed by the machine listening to a particular depth location called the gate or the sample volume that the operator sets. This way, the machine knows exactly the location of the echoes generated, but information about speed and direction become limited. This limitation depends on the pulse repetition frequency. The result is an open envelope that represents speeds measured only at the gate. This is important to know because half the pulse repetition frequency is called the Nyquist limit. Pulsed Doppler cannot accurately determine speeds above the Nyquist limit nor the direction of flow. With color flow Doppler, multiple gates are evaluated along each transmission line. By combining data from multiple lines, a 2D image of flow is generated and is superimposed on a regular 2D image. The convention is to assign blue color to flow away from the transducer and red towards the transducer. Similar to conventional Doppler imaging, ultrasound can be used to detect velocity of tissue. However, in tissue Doppler imaging, called TDI, the focus is on detecting high amplitude, low frequency shifts in echoes that are generated by tissue, instead of listening to low amplitude, high frequency shifts in echoes generated by red blood cells. TDI is used to assess cardiac tissue motion, but TDI is not able to discriminate passive motion related to translation or tethering from active motion related to shortening or lengthening of the muscle fibers. But there are techniques such as speckle tracking that can measure relative changes in tissue velocity and determine true contractility from passive myocardial motion. In summary, here's a table of the different flavors of Doppler imaging. Doppler imaging can be used as continuous wave, pulsed wave, or color flow. All modalities assess speed, direction, and location, but to varying degrees. Best at determining location is color flow because of using multiple gates, and best at determining speed and direction is continuous flow. Pulsed wave Doppler is reasonable for most other applications. Now you see that there are several assumptions when a machine generates an image. These include constant speed of sound, straight travel paths, single beams that go through single reflections, and uniform attenuation that is true with its signal intensity. And Doppler shifts that are smaller than the sampling rate, and that movement is always parallel to the direction of the beam. Breakdown in any of these assumptions about time, space, attenuation, and Doppler shifts results in artifacts. And here are a few. When the speed of ultrasound is different in two adjacent media, a straight needle crossing both sections may appear broken, looking like a bayonet, which is the name of this artifact. And when a beam does not travel in a straight line, but is redirected by the edge of a blood vessel or an interventricular septum, you can get an edge or a dropout artifact. When echoes are generated by side lobes or grating lobes, the reflections are assigned to the area of the central beam, giving the false appearance of structures in the middle of the image. Similarly, reverberations and ring downs represent errors in signal placement on the screen. These errors can take the shape of horizontal lines, such as in lung A lines, or lines that appear deep to metallic reflectors. Or these signals may appear as vertical lines, such as in the case of lung B lines, or the bright shadows behind cholesterol crystals or air bubbles in the gut. Similar to previous examples, a mirror image is a miscalculation of the distance of the reflector when the signal does not return to the transducer right away. When an ultrasound beam interacts with an area of high attenuation, the deeper area appears darker on the screen. In this scan of the gallbladder, the beam intensity is decreased deep to calcified gallstones. And the opposite can happen, causing signal enhancement when the ultrasound beam passes through an area of low attenuation, such as a fluid-filled gallbladder in this example. In this example of mitral stenosis on an apical four-chamber view, there is aliasing, where the machine is unable to determine the flow direction or speed. Aliasing occurs when using pulse Doppler and when the sampling rate is too slow for the flow, therefore exceeding the Nyquist limit. Here, velocity profiles are noted above and below the zero line, when in reality they should appear only above the line towards the transducer. And now for my Doppler joke. In 2016, the winner of the Kentucky Derby was a horse named Nyquist. When Nyquist ran, he went so fast, reporters couldn't tell if he was coming or going. At that point, Nyquist exceeded his own limits. So in summary, we went over how an image is generated using the reflections of sound. We also discussed the interplay between attenuation, which limits usability of ultrasound, and resolution, which we are always trying to maximize. We discussed different imaging modalities, some of their limitations, and some of their advantages, including the Doppler effect. And finally, we saw how violating assumptions of image generation can cause artifacts, and how artifacts can result because of space and time variations, attenuation variations, and Doppler effect limitations. Thank you.